Yeah. I heard too that the problem is in Northwestern, you're dealing with the upper of the uppers. You have all the extreme winners. Yeah. Hey, can I talk to you later? We're about to start a college seminar. All right. Yeah. You got on. Did you find out who made the reservation?
It's it's a case of mistaken identity. It's somebody with a similar name to mine. And the holiday put the wrong thing on there.
It's not reserved under our credit card, right?
No.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to put this, actually, I'll stop that for a second. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Krupnick Approach webinar. Thanks for coming. I know people will be shuffling in, but it means a lot. I think this is going to be a productive use of time. I want to sort of go through some of the trends in college admissions, and some thoughts about kind of what it might mean for your students or for you if you are a student. And as people are sort of coming in, I have a couple, so one sort of little, I have a couple kind of requests. One request during this hour, and I can stay a little bit after if people want to. We might maybe go 10 minutes over, 15 minutes over. My first request, actually it's really only one request, is that you guys feel free to just jump in with questions or comments at any point, like literally. So like think of it like a liberal arts kind of style workshop, where like if there's something that you disagree or you're critical or you're not sure you understood or is confusing or press for clarification, it would be great if you guys, I encourage you all to do that. Also to make the atmosphere a little bit more collaborative. So this is not intended to be just a lecture. There will also be time for some questions at the end. But I have a sort of 2 or 3 part agenda, and I'm going to go to this PowerPoint. So let's just get this started. So we got Krupnick Approach college applications in the era. Can everyone see this, by the way? Okay, college applications in an era of holistic admissions. And holistic is in quotes for deliberate reasons. It's in quotes because it's a deliberately self-consciously equivocal term. It's a deliberately obfuscating term. It's a term that colleges use because they don't really know themselves what word they would like to use. They don't really know themselves a more precise word to define what it is that they're doing. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. It's just that it's a deliberately vague term. And we'll talk about what the implications of that are. Some of it actually has to do with the fact that it has to do with a sort of strategic element to it as well. So I also have this quote at the bottom. So this is from Will Rogers. I think it's just a great quote because it really captures a lot of the stuff that was going on right now, this college process. It isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble. It's what we know that ain't so. So in other words, it's the things we think we know that we don't really, that we're wrong about. And the unknown knowns or the unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld put it many years ago. Because I think one of the things is that, especially among people who are really among parents, super well-educated parents, there are a lot of perceptions about this that really just kind of date back to your own experiences going to college. And that's of course, there's a fair amount of benefit to that, that gives your students a considerable advantage in the sense that you kind of know the culture, right? You know that you have the kind of cultural capital of the experience of having gone to college or graduate school and what it's like and what the expectations are. But the admissions process has changed so dramatically that it's risky. It becomes a misleading proposition because a lot of the things that worked or were more effective many years ago have changed, and some of the things have taken their place. So that's why I like that quote especially. So let's start. I wanted to just do a brief introduction. Yeah. Question? Thoughts? Oh, okay, I thought I heard something. So I wanted just to do a brief introduction about who we are. I know that a lot of people are very familiar. Your names at least are. Most of you don't have your cameras on, but I think a number of the people here are current families, current Krupnick Approach families. But there's some new people too. And we're going to be there's some people who asked to have a copy of this, so we're going to be recording it and giving it out to some families as well who are interested in hearing what's going, hearing about this and hearing the webinar. So who we are, Krupnick Approach, the way I put it, we're thought partners. I mean, that's it's sort of a pretentious term, but I think it's actually right. It's on the money. I mean, in the sense that we're working together we're thinking together, right? That's what that means. So we'll offer customized high-tech coaching, educational consulting to help students pursue their talent, deepen intellectual curiosity, develop their academic, social, intellectual skills to soar into college. Okay, so this year, and that's actually our services, I'll come back to that. This year, or in general, we offer things like ACT, SAT prep, AP, academic subject tutoring, activity, curricular guidance, extracurricular things, and outside of school organizational guidance, executive functioning support, college selection support, and college admissions probability modeling. So we have a fairly sophisticated sort of Watson, like an AI kind of, that does some college probability modeling. It's not actually AI, but it does have a little bit of machine learning, and it's based on a large database, like a sort of a University of Chicago applicants at the individual level. So that actually can become very helpful as well for thinking about modeling college probability odds. And we talk with, we're in regular conversations with people at these schools. We know some of the admissions people. We know with students who are at these schools who serve as ambassadors as part of our program, which is another thing that part of the admissions probability involves, helping demonstrating interest and we can potentially work with some of our ambassadors. Our ambassadors are students who are at these schools who know the process or know what it's like to be at this school better than anyone. Certainly including us, including anybody who's a professor there, including admissions people, because they are actually there, like on the ground, like as students. College essay assistance is probably the cornerstone of what we do for college consulting. The essay has become it's a literary genre unto itself. It is a creative nonfiction essay, is the personal statement is. And then in addition to the personal statement, as you guys probably know, for the Common App, there's also going to be, you'll have multiple supplemental essays, on average 2, 3, sometimes 4 supplemental essays, and there are templates for those that we can talk about. But all told, I mean, your student or you will have, by the time you're done with this, will probably have 50 pages of supplemental and college personal statement essay material. Enough material for a small book. You could go to publish this and go to talk to somebody and think of it as these are short stories. They're nonfiction ideally, but they're short stories. They're nonfiction essays. So it's a big process, and it's really time consuming. And so a lot of what we do is we help students crafting, organizing, thinking through, facilitating this process, and also making it more efficient. And I can talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, about how to create templates. Because ultimately, no human being in a 6-month period could sit there and write, 50 essays. I mean, Stephen King, or most prolific people, Balzac, right, wrote like 150 novels. He couldn't write 50 essays in a 3 or 4 month period that are all different, right? So the goal of the essays in general is not to write 50 good essays. The goal is to write 7, 8 transcendent essays. The goal is to write 7 or 8 or 6. I mean, every student is going to be a little different depending on where you're applying, but a certain number of essays between 5 and 10 that are all absolutely, fantastic. And then you switch them around, you mix and you match. And that gets you a lot more bang for your buck. It's also a lot faster. So this is the sort of depth over breadth or quality over quantity idea, but it's also this sense that there's a tremendous amount of overlap between among the kinds of questions that different colleges ask. We also are starting to do some college financial aid scholarship and support and guidance. That has been the thing that the single most salient, if there's been a single big factor this past admission cycle. We had our most successful admission cycle ever this year in terms of the outcomes, but more parents than ever have before expressed interest in learning more about scholarships, financial aid, and how to sort of go about that. So we're incorporating some financial. We've done some financial aid research. We've done some hires on the financial aid side. So we will be doing more. We will be doing. If that's something that you guys need and want or are interested in, especially on the side of the scholarship essays and how to put your best foot forward on essays. We're in a really good position to help with that too. In terms of, I heard it like a murmur. Is anyone okay? Okay. This year, so this was a really good year for us. I mean, for our students, right? Our students, we're working at any given time with maybe 60 students who are. Our overall numbers are number of students is much higher, but we're working about 60 students who are doing 70 students, maybe doing college acceptance programs where they work with us in these fully integrated college programs that are scaffolded around, the essays, around college selection, around interview guidance, around recommendation support, extracurricular, and those are great programs. And among those students, 3 of them are going to Harvard, 2 to USC, 2 to Columbia, 2 to Berkeley, 3 to Georgetown, 3 to University of Chicago, 3 to Northwestern. Then we've got somebody going to Yale, Dartmouth, Cornell, Penn, William, Brown, Caltech, Rice, Wisconsin, Madison, Michigan, University of Illinois Engineering. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing some, Emory. But out of, for a class that big, for a class that small, and for a class of 50 or 60 or 70 people, it's, we're really excited. But people have been extremely thrilled. And the interesting about it was it started out as a terrible admission cycle. So the first part of the admission cycle was extremely frustrating. And students who wound up getting into Harvard and to Yale and to Dartmouth later were getting denied by other places that you'd expect that they would get into, like University of Miami and Boston University and American University. So there's some really unpredictable elements in this. And that has changed over the last couple of years. And that's something I want to pay a lot of attention to, because the model, all of these things around admissions are changing in real time. So that's one of the things that we offer, which is that, we're adjusting. We're like, this is all happening in sort of accelerated time frame. And we're constantly sort of, we're watching the ticker tape, right? And watching as these prices change for earnings reports or whatever metaphor you want to use. Point being that this is something that over a couple of months can change, and it changes them over admission cycles to admission cycle. And I want to definitely talk about that, because in some ways that's really the theme here of what I'm going to talk about. So next, moving on, I got to move a little more quickly. How do you use us? Well, we think of the process in sort of 3 ways, and then financial aid would be a 4th thing that we would sort of add on to it. In terms of the process of applying to college and how we help students, requirements are the things that that used to get you into college, right? Academic coursework, ACT, SAT, AP exam prep, sort of the stuff that's kind of necessary but not sufficient. The requirements get you a seat at the poker table. They get you in the door. They get you an invitation to the party. Most selective schools, and even in less selective schools, 3/5 of the applicant pool, they will just take right off the top, remove from the process because they don't meet the standards that they've set for internally. Usually they're not explicated, that they've set internally for academic grit, usually GPA, to some extent also ACT, SAT scores. So you want to be in that 2/5, right? You want to be in that talented 2/5 area, where and then it's the other areas, it's the other things, not the grades, not the requirements, that make the difference. It's these 2 other factors. So one involves strategy and positioning, and the other is discovery. So these are the 3 components that we think of, how we think about it, at least: requirements, strategy, positioning, discovery. Strategy, positioning, and discovery are highly correlated, highly intersect a lot. So, because the irony about all of this, I mean, the thing that just remains the case, and I think it's probably the case more now than it ever has been, even though this process has become a lot less humane, is that the things you can do to help yourself, or your things that your student can do to help them get into, you know, the top colleges, also happen to coincide with the things that they want to do and are interested in. Now, by that, I don't mean like playing video. I mean, video games is not, that's an interest. That's not, I mean like movies. I mean, like things like, if your student has a crazy, wild, idiosyncratic love of entomology, right? Or something like that, right? Like, or stamps, I don't know, whatever. If they have a very unusual love of something in particular, study of insects or study of stuff, that is something that can be mobilized and harnessed and really made use of for the college process. We have a student this year who has a passion for the Rubik's Cube. I guess the Rubik's Cube has witnessed a kind of revival years, although I didn't realize this. And basically, this kid was doing this stuff that I just had remembered, you know, I just knew about from the 1980s. And it started an entire organization around teaching students math by using the Rubik's Cube. It's just fascinating. I mean, you know, it's the sort of thing that, you know, who would ever think to do something like that, right? And he brought in minority students and he taught them how to do all these tricks with it. And they have them on video. And it's kind of, trying to teach students how to think by using the Rubik's Cube. Anyway, it doesn't have to be the Rubik's Cube. It doesn't have to be the study of insects. It doesn't have to be stamps. But if you have interests like that are unusual, those are the sorts of things that can really help you get into college. Sometimes the way I put it is, you know, when everyone else is zigging, you want to zag. You want to kind of go in a different direction. So that's kind of how we sort of see this more broadly. I've talked about this. I've done enough sort of bragging and pitching. I want to jump into the thesis of this actual discussion. But yes, we have best track record, I think, anywhere. 93% of our students who are enrolled in one of our college acceptance programs is accepted into one of their top 3 schools. I don't know that any school, any program has anything like that. Our average ACT is 7-point improvement, average SAT is 250-point improvement. But that 93% is really the most important thing, because in this day and age, when you have, you know, schools that have admissions rates at 10% or below, that's an important feature. And so with that, I want to talk. Let's make this transition into what we're actually going to be really getting into. I've kind of already alluded to some things, but here are the basic themes for today. So one is the discussion. There's a thesis. There's a sort of thesis-driven idea. I mean, you know, graduate school, so I'm used to doing. When I was younger, I used to do these PowerPoints that were all very thesis-driven for, you know, the academic community, and so I felt the need to have some sort of thesis. And I think there is a thesis here about how college admissions operates and what the sort of big core themes are, or what, in some ways, what the governing theme is. So one, I want to sort of talk about this old versus new paradigm for admissions and what that means. 2 is, you know, ways to treat the new paradigm as an opportunity while preserving your sanity in the process. In the process of doing that, I'll kind of bring in things about how to use us, which I've already kind of discussed to a certain extent. And then I want to leave enough time for questions. That's me. I've got to get moving. Okay, so if you want to picture, and everybody can see this, right? Okay, okay. If anyone can't, please let me know, or if there's any way, if it's too small or whatever, but it's you can see with enough clarity. So this is an idealized and a somewhat unrealistic, but nevertheless in form depiction of how college admissions used to look. You've got a family, very happy that the parents are hugging their kids and they're nestled in the comfort of their loving arms. I mean, and everyone has smiles on their faces. And that's the way it used to look. This is how it looks now. And this is a painting by Bosch of the Garden of Earthly Delights. And this is a part of a triptych that's in the Prado, 15th century Flemish art. I think it's a terrific painting. It's a depiction of hell. And as you can see, there's a lot of chaos here. And the depiction is of chaos. And I think that it feels probably to you, I don't know, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. Most of our students, the last couple of years of students, have felt that there's a lot of internal unrest. And that a lot of what we wind up doing is sort of demystifying and helping reduce anxiety, not only reduce the chaos, not only for the students, but also for the parents, because this is another part of what makes this chaotic or makes it complicated is that it's unlike the ACT, SAT, that you're not taking, students not just doing this entirely on their own. The kid is going to college, but you're paying for it. You will not have that student, that child of yours in your house next year. And they will, this is their rite of passage. This is a transition to the next phase, maybe not to adulthood, but it's certainly a bridge to adulthood. And so this is college admissions now. It has become a lot more complicated. It has become a lot more sophisticated. And it is also, I think in some ways more anxiety provoking, and it's more difficult to get in. So I have a next thing here, I have this little depiction of John F. Kennedy's essay to Harvard, which, I just thought, I think it's always interesting to look at how sort of these very more vivid images of how something has changed. Well, you figure that most students in general, they write a really good essay for college, are probably spending, all of their essays combined, are probably spending 500 hours or something, right? I mean, you start your essay in the summer and it goes all the way to the end of the year, and you're probably averaging 2 hours a day or something like that. It's 300, 400 hours. So this is John F. Kennedy's essay. My understanding of it was that he was sitting on a chair next to a room where he had just been interviewed. And this was his essay that he wrote in, like 5 minutes. And, there's typos, and granted, it's John F. Kennedy, right? So, maybe if John F. Kennedy were applying now, he could do the same thing. But the sense though is that this is kind of how it used to operate. It's not even done on typewriter. The reason I want to apply are several, right? I feel that Harvard could give me a better background in liberal education than any other university. I've always wanted to go there, and I have felt that it is not just another college, but is a university, okay, with something definite to offer, right? He's doing all the things that you cannot do in a college essay, right? He's being vague. He's being sort of excessively deferential. Then he says something even worse. This is the sort of ultimate, this is the even more kind of off limits, politically at least. I would also like to go to the same college as my father. I mean, you can't, that's another thing you can't really say. Maybe again, if you're John F. Kennedy, to be a Harvard man, again, this sort of non-neutral gender terms, is an enviable distinction, and one I sincerely hope I shall attain. Anyway, this is obviously a massively different era. So I want to jump into kind of how things have changed. So the paradigm for college admissions pre-COVID and post-COVID. So let's say 2020, and now 2020, since 2020 to now. So what are the big features? What are the things that have changed? Well, this heading here, this chart, is probably the most important. Now we've done some statistical analysis on things using some of our probability data. Some of it is anecdotal, some of it is based on people at colleges that we've talked to. And we've assigned different weights for these different criteria. And so it used to be the case, academics were 60%, and that's conservative. Academics were maybe 60% of the application. So 60% of the decision about whether you get in or not would be due to grades and scores. Now it's more like 40%, and that's maybe even a little too high. The personal characteristics, so college essays, recommendations, distinguishing characteristics, used to be about 15%. Now they're a bit double, so they're now about 30%. Activities and athletics have kind of stayed roughly equivalent, but notice also demonstrated interest has gone up. And that's something I want to talk about, because that doesn't just connect to admissions odds, it also connects to not falling through the ground. There's a whole ethic around making sure that you're applying to an roughly equivalent number of safeties, targets, and reaches. But the definition of a safety is very elusive and very tricky, because their colleges are practicing yield protection now. Colleges are using an algorithm that is vastly more sophisticated than anything any of us could come up with. And they are determining, based on this algorithm, the odds of your student attending the college that they just got, that they're looking at you for. So if you have so this is why, we have students who have 4 3s and 4 4s, and then they don't get into some school, and then they get into Yale or something. And so part of this becomes a matter of demonstrating to colleges who are dubious and skeptical and algorithmically biased against your student. This is a safety school, for any safety school, because you are so-called, quote unquote, overqualified, which of course they would never tell you, unlike potentially an employer. Your job is to, or your student's job is to demonstrate to at least one or two of those safety schools that he or she really wants to actually attend that school. And part of that involves actually doing the research and going and visiting safety schools, schools you're calling safeties, and really demonstrating to yourself and you're demonstrating to the college that these are schools that where you'd be happy. Because things, you know, this is in all realms of life, you've got to be somewhat, you have to hedge your bets, diversify. And so you want to hedge against the risks around your targets and your reaches. And this, the yield protection process has made this very challenging, but that's part of what this part of what demonstrated interest will become about. And so the goal then becomes something about really finding a school where you might actually not be miserable, even though it might be a safety school, where you might actually be happy, and then communicating with people at those universities to demonstrate that you're interested in possibly attending. So I'm going to keep moving. The way I would call this, I think if there's a thesis about the way admissions operates now, it's that it's at one and the same time more and less human than it was at any other point in history. So it's more human in the sense that it's more humanistic. The college process is to a much greater extent based on being interesting as well as just being impressive. It used to be the case you could be they looked at you and if you were impressive, that was the main criterion. Now you have to be somewhat impressive, but being interesting ultimately is even more important than being impressive. In other words, being someone who's unusual, being someone. So I talked to somebody at the University of Chicago, an admissions officer at the University of Chicago, who told me that this is an interesting way of putting it, but that for University of Chicago, the way they look at these essays and look at applications is students is that a student is a good applicant if they are somebody that you'd want to have coffee with, but a student is a great applicant if they're a student you want to go on a road trip with. So that's what you might call more human, right? I mean, the person who the sort of the standards of perfection that we try to strive towards in grades, in school grades, in APs, and in ACTs, you have to move in a very different direction when you're working on the rest of this process, because the rest of the process is about the non-standardization. It's about basically I mean, in some ways this makes it more difficult because they are looking at you as a human being, not just as a student. And the important point about this is that not that they're looking at you and evaluating you as a human being. I mean, maybe they are. But what they're really doing is they're evaluating you as a human being in terms of two questions. They're evaluating, this is what all colleges.
Did you see me?
They're, with the
Over this way, I think.
exception of some schools that have, guys, okay. With the exception of a very small number, what their colleges are doing, they have two principal criteria for you as a human being. One is, will you fit in to our community? And the other is, how will you contribute to our community? And they are, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to know in advance about somebody, right? I mean, how would anybody? I mean, it's sort of like looking at crystal ball. But the point is that this has become a more human process, but it's also become a less human process. So the way in which it's become a less human process and a much less human process, or much less humane process, is that they're looking at you as a human being. They want to know what motivates you, what animates you, what you think about when you get up in the morning, what you think about when you go to sleep, when you have breakfast, when you're not listening, and when your student is in math class but wandering off. What are they actually thinking about? That's what they're interested in. Because anybody can pay attention. What's interesting, what's more important is what is it you're actually thinking about? And is it something that our school could nurture? Is this something that our school could help shape? But there's another side of this, which is that it's a lot less humane. And less humane, by that, what I mean is that at one and the same time, you are expected to be human and personal, but you also, it's an extremely strategic interaction. This is a game theoretical model of the highest order. A mathematical formula for this would have to account for so many iterations of my action, your reaction, my reaction to your action. There are so many sort of there's so much reflexivity in this. There's so much kind of you responding to them, responding to you, that it becomes extremely complicated. And so, I mean, as I said, that it is true that the single most important thing about applying is doing the things you actually love anyway, right? So that's the simple part of it. But the complicated part of it is that there are landmines and pitfalls and things all along the way that colleges have created in order to sort of help to see whether or not you were actually interested in attending their school. So colleges have differentiated from each other a tremendous amount. And there are strategies around this, and there's strategies that you can use in general for colleges, and there's strategies you want to use specifically for colleges. Strategies around, do you decide to early decision somewhere? I mean, that's one of the most important strategic interactions, right? So when you decide if you want to apply somewhere early decision, to a lesser extent early action, you're deciding. You want to think about this in terms of all sorts of different questions. Like, what are the odds? What are the odds if I don't apply here that I'll get in regular? What are the odds if I don't get in here that I would have gotten in somewhere else? Well, how much do I actually want to go to this place versus wanting to go to somewhere else? What difference does it make if I don't apply to this other college regular decision? Is that going to mean I won't be able to get into that college regular decision? So there's an enormous range of things that have to kind of happen all at the same time. That is just that makes this process more and more complicated and anxiety provoking, and that's just sort of the way it is. Try to like control this and create as much clarity as possible, but it has to be very systematic, and you have to go about this in a very well organized way. I mean, and decisions about early action, decisions about even decisions about which ACT scores do you submit. Do you decide to submit or do you not submit? You know, that some schools you'll probably submit to, you might decide not to submit to others. Our rule of thumb on submissions on the strategy side is, if you're above the 25th percentile for any given college, that you submit. If you're below the 25th percentile, it's not worth submitting. The vast majority of colleges are allowing you to self-report your scores. And that has implications too, because it means that if you got a really low score and they happen to super score, if you got a low score in one section, they won't see it until after you're admitted, because then you will actually report your score from the test center. So you'll want to know, is this a school where I self-report, or is this a school where I have to have the score stemmed from the testing agency? And you'll want to know, do they super score, or do they look at your highest score? Do they look at all scores? Georgetown tries to look at all scores. Georgetown has now reinstated their requirement for SATs and ACTs. But 65%, our research suggests that 65% of schools super score the SAT, and I think it's about 62%, 60 to 65%, somewhere in that range, super score the ACT. Most colleges will super score. And of course, there's a strategic question there, which is, do they actually super score? Well, that's another very tricky question. So when you report your scores, you report your composite. You report your composite and you report your super score on the Common App. So the way that I would encourage everyone to think about it is, they both matter. That doesn't matter what anyone says, figure that your schools are going to be looking at your composite, and they're going to be looking at your super score. If maybe they, it's possible they won't, but it's like Pascal's wager. You figure it better be conservative, get good scores on your composite, get scores on your on the super scores as well, and do the best you can. But those are just some examples of the strategy involved. But there's there's a lot of it. And there's even strategies on the financial aid side, and those are all things that are really important to go through. So the level of sophistication among today's students is absolutely is phenomenal. It's staggering. Students could be a lot of the students we have could basically be doing our jobs by the time they're done with this. They know this process so well and so in such a complex way that I think to a certain extent it actually might be detrimental. I mean, I think there are ways in which the sort of level of awareness about all the different things that colleges are looking at can be paralyzing. And so part of the job that we have, especially when you write the essays, is to sort of help students free themselves from the tyranny of all of this data, all these expectations, right? All of this sound and fury. Some of which is not entirely untrue, but may not be unusually helpful in writing essays. So in other words, when they're writing essays, the impossibility of the essay is that they have to be able to write from their deep places of their imagination, while at the same time bracketing the fact that the people reading these essays are going to be ranking them and evaluating them, and they have to not be thinking about the fact that these people are people they'll never meet, will never meet, have no interest in ever actually, will never know them if they saw them on the street, and people who are reading their essays and reading their applications who have absolutely no right to read the things they're writing. I mean, it's completely none of their business. It's totally intrusive. So when I say free themselves from the tyranny of this, it's not, there's an impossibility to this, but to the extent possible, to free students from the tyranny of worrying about whether this is going to be politically correct, whether writing an essay about your grandparent dying, whether writing an essay about race, writing an essay about particular interaction with a particular person on the track field, whether or not that sort of thing is going to be the sort of thing that colleges will like or not like. The rule of thumb is there's no bad essay topic. It should be quite true, but pretty close to being true. But the form is very specific, and the form is a genre. So we try to allow, at the beginning at least, we try to encourage students to write extemporaneously, get paint on the canvas. Try to get as much out as they can just by listening to the voice in their head and really, and really plumbing the depth of who they are. And we will worry about whether or not they'll like it. That's our job. Our job is to serve as a buffer to say, okay, you might not want to say this, but we're not going to let you turn this in until you don't say that. But when you're doing this, do it, feel free and unburden yourself from that. And that's been successful. It's hard to do, but that's part of the interaction. So let me get back into this a little bit. So part of that is that you want to take your student away from the strategic elements of it and back into the human elements of it. Because our job, your job to some extent, and my job and our job, and our Krupnick Approach, is to work on the strategy side as well. So it's much more, usually students do better when they're able to, in some ways the less students know, but the less that they are super conscious of some of the strategic questions and preoccupied with the strategic questions about probability and whether they're going to get in and what they need to do to get in some ways the better, because that means to the extent that they're thinking about those things less, the more they're thinking about what it is they actually want to be doing with their lives, extracurricular activities they actually want to be pursuing. Application essays that actually move them and represent things that they feel strongly about. So that might be something to incorporate into your thinking as well. Anyway, let's go back. So there's a timeline we might think about. So junior year is about standardized tests. Summer activities, you want to have a summer program or something going on in the summer. You want to be doing something that you can either talk about or write about or list in your activities list, which is a compiled list of 10 activities that you submit for the Common App. You want to start your college essays and you want to begin doing tours. Some of these tours can be visits, some of them can be virtual. If you do visits, you want to visit, if you have a broad list, ideally you have narrowed your list down. And when you start, maybe your list is probably pretty big. It sort of goes through this hourglass where at the beginning it's really small and it gets bigger, but then by the end of junior year, it's ideally back down to 25 or 20 schools. If it's down to 25 or 20 schools, then you can make two trips if possible. And maybe you visit 7 schools and you visit early decision and early action schools, and you really spend time at those places. What I wouldn't do when you visit is, the rule of thumb on this is not just to do the tour, actually stay with somebody, actually go to a class, actually spend time with somebody who's at one of these universities to hear what they have to say about their experience. Maybe even talk to a professor. We have connection and contacts with people on both sides. That's what our ambassadors are there for at these schools. So that can become very useful, both for admissions and for your student thinking about whether they want to go there. So then, the next stage after the summer, this is sort of the junior summer, this explore and prepare is a late part of junior year, beginning of the summer. Then by the time we get into the fall, this is sort of part 2. Like part 2 of the process after, I guess this is after the summer, is you get early decision. You figure out whether you want to apply some early decision. You figure out what schools you want to look at for early action. You make sure that you're applying to school early decision that doesn't preclude you from applying to other schools, certain schools that you would want to apply early action. You get your recommendations lined up. I mean, the recommendation for recommendations is probably before the end of the school year. You want to get your school, you want to ask your teachers for recommendations, and then in the fall, remind them. Because I can guarantee you they won't have been writing over the summer. So the reminding them of the fact that they agreed to write the recommendation is a critical part of it, probably the more important part of it. And then you'll start really working on your supplemental essays and crafting and developing and refining your Common App. So these first 2 stages are really organized around that early decision process and early action process. And the way I think there are a lot of different ways of doing this, but one of the ways that we've really encouraged students to do it over the years, and that has worked, I think, been most effective, is to separate the 2 processes, the early decision process and the regular decision process. So the get it together, the senior fall is, is September, the beginning of the fall, to November 1st. And then, and you know what, I mean, you don't even have to know, you don't even have to have a perfect list for your regular decision schools before November 1st. But the second you apply and you get your early decision, essays out and your applications out and your early action essays out, the temptation at that point on November 1st is going to be to let down, is going to be to relax, is going to be like that inevitable relief of having accomplished something, of having given birth to a baby or whatever, metaphor. That is a temptation you want to resist, and you want your students to resist with all human capacity to do so. Because this is the moment, November 1st and November 2nd, maybe take a day off, just to watch a few movies, get some football in or whatever, then get back to work. November 2nd, November 3rd, the first week of November, because this is where the critical part of this process comes in. Unless you get into your early decision school, it is perhaps and probably likely to be the case that your regular decision applications will matter. And the difference between students who do well in the regular decision process and those who don't is that those who don't generally just sort of get complacent, and they figure that they'll wait until they hear from the early decision schools, and then they get really unlucky, and then they're in a tough position. That's what I did, by the way. I got into my early action school, and then I decided I didn't want to go there. So I had to write Harvard, Princeton, and Duke in about 4 days or something. Which nobody, no one could possibly do that anymore. But that's a paradigm that just doesn't really work. So that period between November 1st and January 1st becomes focused around finding the new list, finding a list of regular decision schools. It is right. You want to apply to more schools rather than fewer schools. You want an even split between targets, safeties, and reaches. And I'll talk about why more rather than fewer in a bit, but that's the regular process. January, for the most part, you hear back in March, April, and then there's another phase. There is potentially, if you think of it as there's the summer, 4 phases, the summer phase, the summer phase, you have the early action, early decision phase, you have the regular decision phase, and then you have the famous letters of continued interest phase, also potential scholarships. So if at a certain point as your letters start coming in, if you get waitlisted or deferred, if you are in a position where you have to re-up with something, you can write these letters of continued interest, which become the 4th part of this process. I mean, this has become more complicated than any job that any human being has applied for, other than, I don't know, very few. But so that's sort of the final part of the process. If you're waitlisted, you can potentially find your way out of the wait list by writing a really great letter or having an outside recommendation sent in. And this is where you also want to be thinking about, if you're eligible, thinking about potentially scholarships or financial aid negotiations. Those are the 4 phases, really: the summer, the pre-early action, early decision, the regular decision, and then the wait list, letter of continued interest. And I would treat them as discretely different periods. I would not worry about regular decision. I mean, you want to be thinking about regular and early on, because you want to know where you're not applying early. But once you've determined where you're applying early, that's where the focus should be. That's where all the essays should be focused. And then after November 1st, you can move on to the essays for the other schools and maybe add or remove from your list at will. So I just have a little more to get through. So I have sort of our expert opinion today. So these are some questions that people have raised and sort of some attempts at to answer those questions. So one is, all right, how do I optimize my chances of admissions to my top schools? All right, well, I mean, one way to optimize your admissions is to apply to schools you actually want to attend and have real reasons to attend, other than the fact that they're on a list with the U.S. News and World Report. But the real answer to that, because it's hard. I mean, you don't know. I mean, what's hard about finding schools you want to attend is, how can we know? I mean, it's not as though we've been sitting here sampling colleges for the last 10 years. And so we have a chance to, there's no pregame, right? There's no opportunity to walk into college for 6 months and see, all right, do I like this school or not? There's a huge leap of faith that occurs here. When you make a decision about this kind of thing, and there's a large extent to which there's going to be variables you're not going to know about, and you're also in some ways the most important part is you're not going to know about yourself. I mean, your student, you are going to change in ways that are impossible to fathom, and that's part of the fun of it, really. But how do I optimize my chance to admissions at top schools? Well, consider early decision or early decision 2. Early decision increases your odds by about 1.75. Some people will say it's a lot more than that. At some schools it is. In Northwestern, it's more like 2 to 3. At a lot of schools, it is not anywhere near as great. The Ivy League advantage is very small. It's 20%, 30% advantage. I mean, in terms of like 1.3. Like if your odds were 10%, your odds would be like 13% or something like that. There are a few schools where it makes a big difference to apply early, and it's important to know what those are. Schools like Northwestern, schools like Tulane, schools like American University. Those are schools where they take a very large percentage of their applicants early decision, and where a 70% or 60% admissions rate plummets to a 7% admissions rate when you go to regular decision. But for the most part, for early decision, you might multiply by 1.5, 1.75. Early decision 2 is now being increasingly used by schools. Your odds there probably increase by about 1.25. And then you have early action. Early action is roughly the same as regular decision. Maybe it's 1.05 or 1.1. I would apply to as many. This is the key. This is the core of it, though. To more schools rather than fewer. And this is not just about racking up more fees with us or more fees to apply to more schools. This is about the law of large numbers. This is about statistical odds. That in a world where your odds are 5% or 7% or 12% of getting into a given school, the more schools to which you apply, the higher odds, unless those schools are highly correlated in who they admit. And the good news and the piece of this that's there's a vast misconception about how this works. So most students think they apply early decision to Cornell and they don't get in. Oh, there's no way that I'm going to get into Duke. There's no way I'm going to get into Harvard. They apply to Tulane and they don't get in. There's no way I'm going to get into George Washington. There's no way I'm going to get into University of Wisconsin-Madison, right? There is a perception, there's a sort of Bayesian component to this, that your odds are conditional on other odds. Well, there's very small codependence. So the correlation between getting into one school and another school is very low. It is much lower than you would perceive. So in some ways, this law of large numbers really does work, because if it's the case that the correlations are very low, well, you could almost do the math and figure it out as though they were actually independent. And so in some ways, the joke is, it's not just that you want to apply to as many schools as possible, you want to be denied. You should be expected to be denied by schools. So I would prepare your student to be denied. If you are not denied, if you go through this totally unscathed, unless you apply early decision. If you apply early decision, then you get through it unscathed, you just won the lottery, or you've just got a very successful run. But if you're going through this regular decision and you've been accepted to 10 out of 10 schools, there's something that you could have done differently. There's something that you might have applied to some schools that were a little more difficult to get into. You might have applied to some different schools. You want to be denied. You want to be applying, and probably you will get denied by a lot of schools. There's going to be a lot of disappointment in this process, because the reality is it doesn't matter. Disappointment doesn't matter. What matters is you get one school, right? It's like getting married or whatever. I mean, there's one school and that's it. This is not about bragging that your friends that you got into all 8 Ivies, because nobody does. And the odds are extraordinarily it's striking the extent to which these schools are not related to each other. Anyway, second thing, how do I optimize my? So I think that I would err on the side of 20 schools, 15 to 20. I would go up to 20. We have had a number of students. We had a couple of students get into Berkeley this year, one of whom I think applied to 18 schools, and it would have made a big difference if she hadn't applied to Berkeley. Granted, Berkeley was her number 3 choice. We have a student who applied to Emory, wasn't really thinking about it, and got in, and that wasn't really on her top of her list until she saw what Emory was like, and then got in. This is the sort of thing where you're going to want to apply to more schools, and the point is that when you think about how to optimize your chances at your safety schools, you have to be thinking about yield protection. So our Harvard students in general, we have 2 of our 3 Harvard students got denied by Boston University. One of them got denied by University of Wisconsin. Harvard got into Harvard, didn't get into University of Wisconsin, didn't get into Miami, got into Dartmouth. I mean, these things, it's like throwing darts at it's not throwing darts at a board. But from the perspective of a student, it feels like that. It feels like that because if it was based on merit, it would feel like you were throwing darts on the board, because it isn't merit. It's really more about, again, it's about these 2 core questions, which is, will you contribute to our community and will you fit in? Because those are the 2 big questions, And merit is more or less assumed unless you have to worry, unless your GPA is low. And that's a very important consideration and caveat, because that's a different conversation. If you have a good GPA and you've got good scores, you've got good extracurricular activities, you want to be very careful about your safety schools, because you want to make sure that you don't fall through the floor. You fall through the ceiling, it's one thing, but then to actually, it's like those guys, like they're like fall off a cliff or whatever, they fall into like the house, and like they fall through the ceiling, they fall through the roof, and then they fall through the floor, and then they fall through like the bottom floor. And you don't want to be falling through each of these things, right? The problem is that in the game theoretical world, let's say you don't get into your top schools. Let's say you don't get into Georgetown, right? You don't get into Vanderbilt. Okay, fine. Okay, well, those were that was reach anyway. You have your targets, and you've got a couple schools maybe on the table, but then you have some safeties. And what happens then if University of Wisconsin, right, or Fordham or American University? What if they say, well, no one with your grades has ever been actually matriculated to our school? Like, there's no way, I'm not gonna say this to you, but what if they're thinking that, right? And that's what you want to avoid. And so with that, and the way to avoid that, there are a couple of ways of avoiding it. I won't provide all the secrets for this, but like the biggest way to avoid it really is demonstrating interest, because they perceive your interest in them, just as you perceive their rejection of you as being a personal slight, a personal affront, a scarlet letter on your character or your intellectual capacity. They perceive your application as a hedge, as a sort of second thought, as a qualification. You have to be able to convince them that it's not really a second thought, that this safety school is a place where you'd actually be interested in going. And part of that involves convincing yourself of that too, and having schools that are safety schools that you actually would be willing to attend. How important is the ACT, SAT, an era of test optional college? I guess we're already going to go a little bit over. So slightly less important, still valuable, has signaling value. Test optional is primarily about diversity and inclusion. It's not primarily about COVID. Test optional is about progressive people justly, in my opinion, providing access to students who've historically have had a harder time getting into these schools. For most of the people in this audience, test optional is not especially meaningful. For most of the people in this audience, you're going to want to submit a test score. Students who submit test scores are twice as likely to get in. I think it's like 1.9 times. If you're below the 25th percentile, though, don't submit to a particular school. If you're above it, you probably do want to submit to that school. What has become more important? Well, we've talked about this: essays, demonstrated interest, college interviews as well. College interviews have become a lot more important. How important are freshman, sophomore, junior grades? Junior year is probably the most important, followed by sophomore year. Some schools don't take freshman year grades into consideration at all. Most do. California system doesn't. But how do I optimize scholarships and financial aid? I haven't really talked about this. There's a part that's a financial part, and there's a part that's a consulting part. So the financial part of it is, you want to work with your accountant. Like, think about this, right? Like, get out your big expenses and write-offs the year before admissions. Contribute to your SEP IRA. You want to own non-liquid assets. Apply for private scholarships. There's a whole database, and that's part of what we help students with, is applying for private scholarships. Places that you can cobble together $20,000 or $30,000 relatively easily, because there are a lot of like little things. Put them all together, and they add up. That a lot of little scholarships that people don't really apply for. Negotiate with the financial aid office, another thing. Boy, I'm moving really slowly. Okay, so admissions rates are the lowest they've been in a long time. There's some dilution. So we talked about all these different strategies. Standardized tests, I think we know approximately what's going on here. Mostly they're test optional. There are a few that are test required. We've talked about the super scoring process. The importance of the essays, we've talked about this too, and this difference in the weighting. I can talk about these things. I think the main thing about the personal statement is you're doing three things. You're sort of showing what motivates you. Number one, what do you really love? What do you really care about? You want to show, number two, how you think about the world. And number three is you want to show how you interact with the world. And there are these templates. There are these essay types. This is the typology where you want to have 7 or 8 transcendent essays rather than having 25 good essays. The why us essay, the academic essay, the extracurricular interest essay, the community service essay, and now the identity essay. Most essays that are supplements are variations of those themes. Some are precisely those themes. Now, the why us essay is the one that's different because you have to write something a little bit different. Those are about the schools in particular. And here are a couple things that we've talked about already. I'm sort of moving a little bit more quickly than I had thought, but I was moving more slowly at the beginning. That, you know, to keep your sense of humor, to do what you love, that education is a lifelong process, to hold on to the fact that what really matters about this whole thing is finding things that you actually want to do. If you find something, if your student finds something that he or she wants to do that is even remotely socially redeeming, that will help that person get into college. Pretty much, I mean, I can't say no matter what it is, but if it's shaped and thought about and perceived and presented in the right way, it could make a major, very, very big difference. And this was what the reason for optimism is, what I was talking about, the sort of thesis of the discussion in general, that this is a process that has become more human in the sense that they're looking at you as a fully formed 3-dimensional human being. You're not a two-dimensional cardboard cutout like we were when we were evaluated for college. So that's part of what holistic means. The other part of holistic is that it's deliberately equivocal, is that it's also a little bit more strategic. It's more sophisticated. It requires more sort of strategic kind of thinking and more cleverness and cunning than it ever has before. But the good thing about this is that, so there are more, the standards have become a little bit more human. They're more flexible. You're able to show strengths in relatively non-traditional ways. The other part of this is that you can apply to more colleges now. You can be more creative, and colleges need you as well. So when the tables get turned, you know, you have the opportunity now to make them feel the way you sort of felt, or not quite to the same extent. You know, there's increasing specialization between colleges, so colleges become increasingly different from one another, and even within colleges. So majors, you have more opportunities to study the things that you love. And there are more cultural opportunities to experience, you know, diversity and dynamic campus life, which sound sort of like platitudes, but they actually are real when you get there. They're platitudes when you write about them, often your essays, when most people write about them, but those are real things, and those are really important. So that is most of what I think I had to say. And I think the main thing is this sort of keep your sense of humor, keep your sense of perspective is probably the most important thing. I mean, you know, it's the first big process where your student has the possibility of being rejected and the mystery is unveiled. I mean, the point is, in some ways, the goal is to be rejected. You want to be applying to some schools where you will be rejected, but you also want to be applying to schools where you've got to, you know, where when all is said and done, you'll be able to get into a few of the schools you really want to attend. And the odds are, if to get into the school that you really want to attend, or to a school that you really want to attend, the odds are that you will have to apply to some schools where you don't get in. And so it's important to prepare for that too. And to remember that this is not about whether you're good enough. It has to do with the connections to the college, it has to do with the contribution and the fit. So I think, let's open this up for questions. I can certainly go over, and I apologize for going a little bit over as it was. But yeah, what do you guys, what are some big thought? I see some in the chat. Someone asked about restrictive early action. All right, I'll just do a 2-minute. So someone asked about what about
you too. Did you
What?
shower?
What was that? Early decision too? I'm gonna stop this shit. Yeah. Okay, so a student asked about restrictive early action. I would think of restrictive early action as essentially the Ivy League sort of pretentious and exclusive, exclusionary really method of, it is, I mean, by definition exclusionary, right? Of doing essentially early decision. REA is for all practical purposes the same as early decision in the schools that it doesn't allow you to apply to. So it doesn't allow you to apply anywhere early decision. And for most REA schools, if you apply REA, restrictive early action, you only can apply to state schools early action. You cannot apply to other schools. You cannot apply for the most part for REA schools. You cannot apply to private schools early action. But I would say that the odds for restrictive early action at most of those colleges are a little higher than regular decision, but they're not dramatically higher. 20% maybe. Other questions?
I have a question. Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Over spring break, I took my son to visit USC, and in the presentation by an admissions officer, another parent asked what the correct number of AP courses was to get in. And the admissions officer said, there is no correct number, but that they evaluate candidates based on the average at their own school, which caused a tremor of panic to go through all of the parents whose children are going to competitive, expensive private high schools. Could you speak to that issue?
First of all, that is very impressive. It's an that answer, because that's an admirably honest answer, and it's much more honest and much more specific than you usually get from these people. So what they mean by that is that, so if you're a Parker, a Latin, or a Lab, right, they don't really offer AP classes. So they're not gonna, the colleges are not gonna hold it against you that you don't have 10 fives and 10 different AP tests if your student goes to Latin, Lab, or Parker, or boarding school. So that's part of what they mean. So part of what they mean is that they're looking at the number of AP courses your school is offering, not the number of AP courses, like the number of AP courses your school has offering, the number of AP courses you've taken divided by the number of AP courses your school is offering, as opposed to just the number of AP courses you're taking. So part of it is that what they're trying to do is they're trying to accommodate or allow for students who are coming from these schools that don't have AP programs to be able to get accepted as well. So that's like a huge percentage of the answer to that question, right? So another percentage of it is that, so in terms of like how we're looking at it in other schools, it's really hard to, it's hard to believe that that's really completely true, because number one is, how do they know how many AP students, they don't have any way of knowing how many students took how many AP courses, right? Like they haven't hired some sort of private detective who's out like studying the AP numbers for these different schools. But what they know about is they know how many people have applied to their school and what the APs look like. So that is a basis of comparison. Now, it is not the only basis of comparison, because you're not primarily competing against students from your own school, but it is a basis of comparison. So if you go to a school, if you go to Walter Payton, right, and you find that like, where they offer like 185 AP courses, right, where the kids are like in 7th grade, or they're like already taking AP courses, like freshman year taking like 6 AP courses. Then you want to take a lot of AP courses, probably. Now, it doesn't mean you should take all of them. It means you should take them strategically. If there's certain schools where you might want to take as many as possible. But you want to take them in areas where there are areas that are your strengths. If you're not a math person, don't take a math AP course. There's a hierarchy, an implicit hierarchy of APs, but for the most selective schools, there's a hierarchy of APs. But I don't know how useful it is to think about that either. I would say that the answer to that is that that most of it is about this Latin Parker Lab phenomenon, and to the extent it's really a more broad phenomenon, it's that they are kind of sort of implicitly, but not super statistically, looking at you relative to some of the other students who are going to that are from your school. But that's not as anywhere near as statistical as a lot of the other stuff they do. I don't think. Other questions? Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? Yeah, Barb. All right, so I guess people are asking their questions in the chat. This is the 21st, this is 2023. Okay, can you please repeat your criteria when to submit? Okay, okay, so there's one of the callers in. One of you asked the question about when to submit ACTs. What are the criteria for submitting ACTs and SATs? The rule of thumb that we use is if you're below the 25th percentile for the college, so there's a 25-75 band, right? So when you look at the school, it's like 32 to 35 or something. 32 is their 25th percentile. 27 is 31. 27 is their 25th percentile. So you want to be above the 25th percentile for the college to which you're applying to submit. And if you're below the 25th percentile, you probably should not submit. Of course, if you're below the 25th percentile, the odds are that the college will know that you're below the 25th percentile. So that's kind of what you're signaling. This is all part of the game theory part of it, that colleges love test optional. They love it. I mean, it's a great way for colleges to get as many applicants as possible, to get their admissions rates as low as possible, and to get their average scores up as high as possible, and to choose the people they've always wanted to be able to choose, but have had political problems, political concerns about actually being able to admit. Does that, I'll go to the next one. I don't know if to ask that, but like you mentioned 10 activities. Do we need to have that many, or would 2 or 3 activities be sufficient? Okay, so around activities, when you apply to college, you have to, there's a Common App activities list that is a lot more important than people perceive it to be. But the reason it's tricky is because you're allowed 150 characters per activity. So you have to write about each activity in less than 150 characters, not words, characters. So you want to have 10 things you can talk about, but the answer is both, right? So you want to have a couple. So the ideal sort of application, and again, this is all has to be individualized, because if we start talking about ideals, then that becomes the problem, right? Then if everybody does this, if everyone has the same set of ideals and everyone's doing the same thing, and then no one's differentiating themselves. So how do you differentiate yourself? You differentiate yourself by this, and then if everybody starts doing this, you're no longer differentiated. That's the paradox of all of this. But the sort of ideal, general and principle ideal thing is you have a core, you have a nucleus, you have a set of activities that you really love, that you really care about deeply, and that you go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning thinking about. And it could be a lot of different things. And it's something that you're good at, that you've developed, that you showed excellence in. Those 3 things are most important. Probably the are interested in is the most important. The showed excellence thing is probably the least important thing, but developed is second most. And you want to have a couple of things like that. It could be 1 thing, it could be 2 things. I mean, if you're the classic example of that is a recruited athlete. So the recruited athlete is the classic example of the truly angular, and for the most part, angular student who has 1 or 2 things that are really central. That is their particular athletics. And we call that a hook, right? The 3 hooks are athletics, disadvantaged minority status, legacy donor. That's one of the hooks. What your job is, the creation of that nucleus is about creating your own hook, creating something that will make you distinguish. So you might think of athletics as being part of 1 form of that nucleus. So, but it could be a lot of things. It could be a lot of other things besides athletics as well. Of course, I mean, it could be that you have your own radio show. It could be that you have a particular interest in.
This is important.
In Byzantine art from the 12th century. I mean, it could be a lot of different kinds of things. But you want to have electrons, okay? So you want to have some core things, but you want to have a lot of electrons orbiting around the nucleus. And the electrons is where that 10 activities thing comes in. Now, by the way, this is a generic answer. So if we were talking about this more specifically, it would be a little bit different, it would be modified. But as a general rule, you have a lot of electrons, and what that means is join lots of clubs. Join clubs, just join them. Just things that are different from each other. Just start adding some things to your list. They don't have to be things that you're deeply passionate about. You don't have to become the president. Just show up for the yearbook picture. It's like, this is the sort of thing where you join clubs of things you're interested in, that you actually could tolerate and would enjoy being a member of. Join the medical club or the sailing club or the yacht or the frisbee club or cooking or whatever, yearbook, whatever, all the different high school things that they have these days. Join some clubs. And the reason why, and community service is non-negotiable. You absolutely have to do community service in this day and age, and it has to be more than just a yearbook picture. But the point is that But the electrons are important because they show a kind of, it shows that there are certain incongruities, which are good. We want to have sort of nice, wonderful, beautiful incongruities, like you're the captain of the cheerleading team, and you also have a deep interest in, I don't know, Titian and paintings from the 16th, 17th century. You want to have these weird idiosyncrasies, or dichotomies, right, or incongruities. But the other thing about it that's important is for these electrons is that you can sprinkle them into your essays. You never know when you'll be able to sprinkle in that you were in the Kiwanis Club, you were in the gum chewing club, you were in the club for people who were tasting different kinds of soft drinks for whether they could be chosen, whether they're sugar-free works or not. You're in particular forms of robotics clubs. You're in, the electricity club. You're in all sorts of different things, and there may be a moment where you can throw that in to an essay which is unexpected and unpredictable. And having that to be able to refer to that at a certain point, could potentially be to your advantage. So the electrons are more strategic than they are about intrinsic motivation. The core is more about intrinsic motivation, but I think that's a good question, and we'd we'd want to be thinking about that at a much more granular level, individual level. One thing about activities, and I'm just going to this is very tricky terrain because a lot of people are very protective and take these things very seriously and personally, as they should, is that there are certain stock activities that everyone does, or a lot of kids do, that are just people do because they like them and they become really popular, right? Like Model UN, mock trial, certain kinds of sports, certain kind of professional clubs like medical profession, business, free law, things like that, and math, and like the French the foreign language societies. Those are all pretty, those are areas that are very, most applications consist of 10 activities that are all kind of like permutations and combinations of those things, right? That's like what most applications look like. They're just those activities, and that's the application. Now, I'm not saying that those activities are not important. Especially if you're really good at it. If you're really good at Model UN, that will distinguish you, but you've got to be really good. So Model UN is not going to distinguish you unless you're really good, and it really is important. Just being on Model UN is going to make very little difference because everybody else is on Model UN. Just being on the ping pong team or the bowling team, that actually might be somewhat valuable because that's more unusual. But these sorts of things that you have in common with everyone else in your class have got to be distinctive. They've got to be things where you show real leadership and you have, demonstrated real excellence in those things. Like the food pantry is another one of those things. Like everybody at Ignatius does the food pantry. And but when it comes to community service, the most important thing is having actual interactions with human beings that you're serving, not the walkathons, the food pantry if they're actually working with people, but things where you're actually working directly, like tutoring kids, or like working directly in these neighborhoods with people on things, as opposed to like working with some sort of executive staff or raising money. Those are other things. Yeah. Other questions?
I think my battery.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Somebody?
Joe, I have a question.
Yeah.
I know you kind of spoke of the ACT and SAT extensively, but you had also mentioned, so you can, when they're in 2024, they can just hand in their transcripts for high school without submitting SAT or ACT scores. Is that still going to be an option?
Well, so for some schools it is still an option. For some schools, it is, and for some schools it isn't. So most colleges are still allowing students to not submit scores. Most are permitting test, are still test optional.
But that's for this current year.
Yeah.
We had
this coming year.
That's for this year. So for 2024, because my daughter's a junior, we had like 10 different reps from 10 different schools, and they all kind of said that in this current year, we'll accept transcripts, but in 2024, that's all going to change. It's going to be either an SAT or an ACT, and maybe it was for those specific schools that attended our school. And I'm just curious to see, you know, the communication between some of us parents speaking amongst each other.
So you're saying that the
like different
representative-
interpretation.
What you're talking about is you had a conversation with some admissions people who came to your school, came to high school. And
Correct.
they told you that you should expect that ACTs and SATs would be required in 2024?
Yes. That it's not going to just be transcripts, that this current year, they mentioned that transcripts would be something that they would accept without having an ACT or an SAT. But in 2024, that would be that, depending on the school, I guess, of course. I mean, this panel of schools, they all kind of said the same thing, like, yes, well, we're going to require an SAT or an ACT.
So number one is I'd be interested in hearing which schools those are. But the other thing is that
It was like Loyola. It was like Loyola was there, Purdue. I'm trying to think of the schools
I
that
would
were
be
McCarthy.
very surprised if they said that, or I'd be very surprised for two reasons. One is I'd be surprised if they said that because they'd be giving away inside information before they were released to the public.
Okay.
That's pretty significant. That's like, you know, somebody telling you at a company there's a patent that they've got they're going to have to coming out with next year, and, you know, just getting on the stock now. Like that's like very important piece of information that they wouldn't just give, that they wouldn't simply dispense at a meeting like that unless it were already made public.
It's going to be required. They said they're going to want an SAT or an ACT. You know how certain schools
Yeah, but-
wanted one or the other, depending on the school, but now most schools will take either or.
Well, but it was always the case. It has always been so. Other than like when all of us, the parents and me, since 2010 or something, you've been allowed to choose between the ACT and SAT. So that's not new. Like you've always been for the last 20 or 15 years, 12 years, 13 years, you've been allowed to choose to score, to submit one and not the other. It used to be the case you had to submit the SAT if you were on the East Coast or the West Coast. You had to submit the ACT if you were in the Midwest. Now it is the case, and it has been the case for 15 years, that you're allowed to submit either the ACT or the SAT. So that hasn't changed.
Okay.
But what you're saying, what you're talking about is that the colleges are telling you that they're going to be test required starting in 2024. I think that's I think it's unlikely that they intended to say it that way for two reasons. One is because they'd be revealing something that's that's sufficiently significant that is sufficiently like it's both significant, it's sufficiently significant and sufficiently like private. It's not hasn't been made public yet, that they wouldn't, it just wouldn't be something they would just throw out there like that. The second reason is that most or some colleges have already announced that they're going test optional until like 2025 or even as late as 2027. Or in the case of Columbia is going test optional permanently.
Okay.
I don't think the test optional is going to go away. And I mean, I run a test prep company, you know, so like, if anything, my incentive would be to say, oh, you know, I do think the SAT is important, but, you know, we're not going to see a world where people are going to go back to requiring tests. I don't think immediately.
Okay.
There will be some schools that do, but it would be very surprising if everyone goes back to being test required in a couple of years. That'd be very surprising. And I think that when that person was talking to you, my intuition is that they may have said, well, this year we're going to be test optional, but we don't know what we're going to do in the future. And that could have been interpreted as we may be test required in the future. I mean, do you have in writing anyone saying that? If you've been writing somebody saying that, that would be interesting.
Yeah, it was in one of the meetings. I can ask the the person who was in charge at school. I can ask them, but it was in one of our meetings, and a couple of us parents had talked about it. So we were like, But
there definitely are a growing number of schools that require scores. That is true. And that number is not like 2 or 3. I mean, it's like, 15, 20% or something like that. So
Would
I
you
think-
say that those are more of like the 10, like the bigger schools versus the
it's
Then
actually
that-
pretty unpredictable. I mean, the small liberal arts colleges are more likely to be test optional or test blind usually.
right?
The schools in the South has a reputation for being, if you're looking at college in the South almost entirely, with the exception of maybe Duke, value the ACT, SAT more than schools elsewhere in general, like as a stereotype, it's true. So, I mean, the crux of this is that most schools are going to be test optional. Some schools are going to be test required, but that the ACT, SAT is still important because you want to signal to them that you have a decent score, that you're not below the 25th percentile.
Right.
And your odds of getting in with a score are probably twice as high as they would be if you didn't have a score. I don't think that we're going to go back to being entirely test required, but there are definitely some schools that are test required. I mean, I could, this is all changing in real time, but that's the guidance we're getting in this right now. There's another question about, does that answer that? Because that was a pretty, does that answer your question though?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. We can talk about that offline too. Another student asked about how does the need-based financial aid go into the admissions process, such as need blind? Yeah, so this is another thing. So there's a question about, I think, if I'm interpreting this correctly, question about if you're applying to a need-based, so if you're applying to a need blind college, the implication is that your admissions odds don't change if you actually are applying for financial aid, right? And this student or this person or parent is asking, is that also the case for, or what does that mean for schools that are not need blind, like schools that are need aware? So if you're applying to a school that's need aware, financially need aware, does that affect your odds of getting in if you announce that you will be looking for financial aid? Well, I actually have not seen any real data on this. So I can't say with a great deal of authority what the answer is, but my suspicion, everything that I know about this world, and the sense that I have, and from our students, is that it probably has some impact, but not a huge impact. So like, and it wouldn't necessarily, I mean, part of the thing is that in a day and age where it costs what, $80,000 a year to go to college, and where a lot of the thresholds now are actually relatively high for, like, you have to be in like the upper, you have to have income in the upper like 5% to not be eligible for aid for a lot of schools. So if you're applying for financial aid, you're applying with most of the other students applying to those colleges too. So in other words, it's not as though you're some horrible exception or some unusual exception, like you're the only one applying for financial aid and that would hurt you. So many people are applying for financial aid and so many people will need financial aid that it's statistically, it's hard to imagine that it would have a huge impact on admissions, your odds of admissions. Maybe it would have a slightly negative effect overall, but it would not have a major impact. It would have a slightly negative effect probably if you're applying to a need aware school for financial aid. Tough question that one. Any other questions? Yeah, the financial aid piece is tricky because it's something where you have this large group of people, many of whom are sitting here among, or represented by you guys, right? The panoptical names that I see across the screen. And you guys are in sort of like the hardest position in some ways for the financial part of it, because a lot of you will not be eligible for financial aid. And yet it's not like, it's not like just, writing a check for like a grocery store bill to pay for it. So in other words, it actually has some impact on your family's well-being. And so like, that's a really tricky place to be. And I think the best advice is that, you know, you're probably not going to be able to get financial aid for your family from the school, but it's where some of the things that we're doing with students to find private scholarships can be helpful. So you really can put together, you know, a fairly large amount of money. I mean, it's actually kind of striking because, like, you know, you think, okay, well, $1,000 isn't much, but if it takes you an hour to write an essay, it's $1,000. You're making $1,000 an hour. You know, I mean, you can apply the essays to a number of different schools too. Or I'm sorry, a number of different scholarships. So that's really worth looking at. And it's a shame that there's not a better source of information about scholarships, but we have some good databases and can be helpful for that as well. In addition to the college admissions essays. So, all right, thank you, everybody. This has been a pleasure. I hope I'm gonna, you know, definitely do more of these, and I hope you guys, you know, we'll probably do more of these. You definitely join the program. You know, this process is, it's like voting. You want to be early and often, right? You want to do it, get started early, and you want to work as much as you can. But it's also, it's you know, having more information and getting on top of it relatively early is going to save a lot of anxiety down the road too, because it's just, yeah, it's a complicated process now. All right, thank you.
Thank
Thanks to
you.
everybody. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It was great having you guys on.
It
And
was-
great questions too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you.
You got it. Thanks, guys.
Hey, Joe,
Yeah,
would you share this presentation with us?
yeah. You mean the PowerPoint?
Yeah, PowerPoint.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I
Thank
can
you.
just email it to you if you want.
Yep, thank you very much.
Yeah. I'll stop the recording.